Hello, and welcome to Book Club Live. Welcome to Terri White's book, Coming Undone, where we get to be together with Terri for a virtual book club. I'm Helen Bagnall. I'm the founder of also Festival, of Salon London, and also Book Club Live. Thank you so much for dedicating this part of your Sunday evening to books. We really appreciate it. And I just want to say thank you to Anna at Canongate, and I say hello to the Salon London members, hello, and especially to Sylvia and Lizzie. Hello. So it works a bit like this. If you haven't joined us for one before, I'll be in conversation with Terri for about 30 minutes and be talking to her about the main themes of her book. Then we'll have a small break just so you can get a cup of tea or refill your crisp bowl. Live dangerously, that kind of thing. And then we'll get together and put some questions to Terri in the second half. It's really, really easy to be involved. There's a comment section on the second half of your screen. If you can just put your comments and questions in there, then I can put them to Terri. And you can do that as we're going along, as it comes to you, or in the break if you want a bit of time to reflect. So I'm really pleased to welcome Terri White, author of Coming Undone. Terri is the editor-in-chief of Empire magazine, the film magazine based here in London. But for many years, she worked as an editor in New York City, winning many awards, including being named as one of Folio's top women in media. And so she was shortlist editor of the year. And she also worked as editor-in-chief of Time Out New York. What a job. You may have seen her writing in The Guardian and Grazia. And she's now written her book, Coming Undone, which is a frank, courageous and moving and very funny memoir. Hello, Terri. Hello. So your book is just published a few days ago, in fact. How does it feel to see your story out in the world?
It actually feels very different, I think, than I imagined it would. So I think I thought it'd feel incredibly revealing, maybe a bit embarrassing, because it's so honest about so many things that I was concerned that once it was out, all I'd feel was kind of exposed. But I have to say, it's been incredible. People have been so supportive. And actually, it feels very liberating to finally have my story published, and there to kind of be no more secrets, nothing left to hide. It actually feels much more liberating than I thought it ever would or could.
Oh, it's really interesting. I really want to talk about that a little bit more. To give a bit of context for the book for people who haven't read it, 'cause it's just out. There are two distinct stories or strands in your book. The first strand is all about this time in New York as an editor, living this New York lifestyle, winning awards. But you were gradually, as the title says, coming undone with heavy drinking, prescription drugs, and you end up in a psychiatric unit in New York. And the second strand tells a story of you at a much younger age and describes the emotional and physical and sexual abuse you suffered in your home from your mother's partners as a young child. And I was rereading the book yesterday, and one of the descriptions says your memoir is one of the most affecting memoirs they've ever read. And I so agree. And so I guess the question I really wanted to start with was, you couldn't have known what the reception was going to be. Why did you want to share this story, your story?
Well, I started writing the book, and it wasn't even a book at first. I came out of a psychiatric ward. I was trying to think of something to fill my evenings with because I was in AA at that point, and I was in outpatient rehab, and I was trying not to drink or go anywhere where there was alcohol, which was quite hard when your job is editing a magazine that's all about going out in New York City. So a friend of mine kind of just challenged me to write these 50-word stories. And I started doing that, and over kind of, 6 years ago, it started to become longer pieces, longer stories, and it became clear at some point that I was going to try and make this into a book. And, I think often it's really hard to write about trauma when you're in the midst of it, or when you're not doing so well, or when you just don't have enough distance. And I think writing the book in the last couple of years was just the perfect time for me. I'd got enough distance from both my childhood and what had happened in New York, but I finally kind of felt ready to tackle all of that stuff. So I actually don't think I could have written it at any point other than this one.
It's like when you were going in, so when you were starting that process of bringing it together as a book from kind of writing exercises, in the time you had to write it, did you have a sense of, not who your reader was, but a sense of what you wanted readers to take from it in terms of trauma and mental health?
I didn't, and I very consciously decided not to think about a reader when I was writing, which is the complete antithesis of everything I've been taught. So as a magazine editor, your entire job is to tell the story with the reader in mind, constantly think about what that person wants. And with this, I thought, if I start to imagine people reading it, if I start to imagine what other people want this book to be, then it will just not be the right book that I need to write. So I deliberately kind of developed this relationship that was just between me and the page, didn't include anyone else. I didn't show anyone the book. It was a very private, very intimate thing when I was writing it. I knew I wanted it to be very honest and unflinching and very detailed, potentially quite graphic about the abuse I'd suffered, about the kind of consequences of that, about what heavy drinking looked like, about what self-harm looked like, but that wasn't really a reader-focused decision. That was about the story that I needed to tell and the feeling that, you know, the only way to write about those things is with honesty and with real truth, and you know, to make yourself uncomfortable, essentially, because trying to cut away from those things just felt like completely the wrong approach, because trauma isn't, you know, built out of these kind of metaphorical experiences. I always say you don't experience memory as metaphor. So it was very important to me in the book that I didn't couch things in metaphor, that I didn't kind of cut away from hard details, that I really immersed myself in that. And I think as the book went on, that did become more about a responsibility to somebody who may be reading it who'd been through the same thing and wanted to see a more realistic depiction of that stuff in a book.
Yeah, very brave writing and, you know, brilliant results. I want to talk to you about living in New York, which is the strand, as we mentioned at the top. You were editor-in-chief of Time Out New York, as you said. You know, it's a huge job, and it is a big thing to live abroad anyway. And New York has a certain allure, you know, it just always has through our kind of like generation. And I just wanted to know, what was it fulfilling a dream for you to be in New York?
I think it always been a dream for sure, and I think maybe our generation specifically, we were raised on this cinematic diet of New York, from records, from books, from movies, from TV shows, and the New York we're so often presented with is this place of dreams, this place where the impossible can happen, this place where you can be anything, you can achieve anything. And I find that really attractive. And, you know, but also the visual cinematic nature of New York is astonishing. The thought of walking those streets, walking across those bridges, was really intoxicating and exciting for me. And I think I probably was quite naive when I pitched up in New York, thinking it would help me develop a sense of self, thinking that if I could be a success there, then that may fill some of the holes in me and I may feel valued. And I really underestimated, I think, the hard edges of the city and some of the more brutal nature of the city. And that was quite a shock to me, I have to say, because I'd visited many times. And when you visit, it's not something you have to experience. But I think when you live in a city day to day and you're trying to kind of exist and you're trying to navigate a city, you come across a much more honest reflection of the city than you ever do when you're just kind of there temporarily. And that experience was quite shocking to me, how hard I found New York. And I think the mixture of my vulnerability, my fragility, my kind of already precarious mental health, I think New York was in many respects the worst place to try and deal with those things.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's a really unusual way of writing about New York, I think, because of the way you say we're sort of so seduced by it as a city. And it does come across as kind of very brutal, very demanding, a very cold city, which is really unusual to read about. I wanted to ask a wider question, though, is that, you know, do you think that New York, the city of New York, played a role in you becoming ill there? I mean, is it significant that you ended up in the psychiatric unit in New York rather than at home in London?
Yes, I think it definitely exacerbated it. I think all of the kind of worst bits of what I was going through were really amplified and exaggerated by the city. I had moved, 3,000 miles away from my friends and my family. I knew one person in New York. I had a very demanding job. So I felt very isolated as soon as I arrived in the city. And all of those things that I was feeling just kind of sped up quite quickly. And I think I would probably have had support systems in place at home. I think it's not that I wouldn't have gone through that mental health crisis, but I think the outcome would have been very different. And I think, you know, this kind of, I developed this almost two sides of my personality and my persona, where I was one person at work and professionally, and worked very hard on cultivating a quite a together, professional, ambitious, committed figure on the outside, and then on the inside, and I spent a lot of time, pretty much all of my time out of work, on my own. Then those were the hours in which I really fell apart, and you know, was drinking and self-harming and all those kind of outward manifestations of how bad I was feeling, really. But yeah, I genuinely don't think the outcome would have been the same had I been at home. And I think New York was kind of the stage was set really for what was to come. And as I said, it was that mixture of me and the city together created, I think, quite a unique and volatile situation.
And what a place to end up being in a psychiatric unit. You know, really feel for you. I mean, you know, what was it like to find yourself in a locked unit 3,000 miles from home in New York?
I mean, it was terrifying. You imagine it sounds terrifying, right? You're like, that sounds cool. It was terrifying. There's kind of no other word for it. And you know, you see those things, those places depicted in TV shows and in films, and then when you're there, it's really scary, because I've been a person who was always so independent, and it was very important to me to control my own life. And suddenly you're in a place where you have zero control over anything. You eat when you eat. You take medication when you're told to take medication. There are lots of rules around what you can and can't do. You know, the very fact of it being a locked door, that was really hard psychologically. There was no outside space, so we couldn't go outside, and, you know, just not being able to breathe in the air, to get any kind of outside kind of space, or just to be able to, you know, smell the streets and hear the sounds, because you're in a place with wire mesh on the windows and locked doors at the end of the corridor. And you also don't know how long you're going to be in there for. So the whole thing is, you have no sense of if it's going to be the 72 hours, or if it's going to be 5 days, or if it's going to be 2 weeks, or if it's going to be 3 months. There were people in there who'd been in there much longer. And that's really scary, because you don't have I very much always liked to be in greatly in control of my life. I knew exactly what was happening every day. It was completely within my control. So to have that taken away is genuinely terrifying.
You know, and there's a really poignant moment in the book where you see your kind of different identities, or two identities, sort of crashing into each other, you know, and you're in this locked psychiatric unit, and you trying to explain, and you're incredibly professional, incredibly patient to the staff, that you just need to get out by tomorrow morning because you've got a meeting at 10. So as long as you can just, you know, get out, all of this is fine. But, you know, I need to be out by 10 tomorrow, and then everything's fine. And, you know, it just must have taken, leading up to that point, absolutely superhuman efforts to keep those selves separate in your life.
Yeah, and that was really important, because work had always been a place of refuge for me. In a way, you know, the negative was that it was all consuming, and it completely swallowed me up. The positives was that it had always been a refuge for me, a place where I could succeed, a place where I could feel valued. So making sure that that side of me was the one that everybody saw, and that I was still considered a success, that I was still considered a professional, again, because all of my value was bound up in that. That was really, really key to me. But actually, you know, the more distinct those two sides of my personality became, and the more I kind of tried desperately to keep one from bleeding into the other, the more extreme things got. And, you know, it was quite clear eventually that I had to kind of reconcile those two parts of who I was to even begin to be in with a chance of getting well again. And
so was it about this time that you began to make the link between your mental health in New York and your childhood trauma?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always obviously knew that was really at the heart of it, but I'd never wanted to confront it. So I used to say a lot, oh, you know, that person who that happened to has nothing to do with me. She has, you know, that was a different person. And I worked, you know, really hard for a lot of decades to completely disconnect those two things. And I just thought if I could forget it, if I could get over it, as people like to say, then everything would be okay. And so I knew that was kind of, at the heart of it and at the root of it. But when I was writing the book, because the book initially was much more focused on New York, it was about the incident in the psychiatric ward, how I got there, and kind of the months and years leading up to it, specifically in New York. And then as I was writing the book, it became clear that I couldn't possibly begin to unpick what happened in New York until I unpicked the stuff of my childhood. So that's where the structure of the book came from, and that's where those two kind of narrative threads came from, was very much actually the book kind of this whole thing demanding to be written and demanding to be read, which was the childhood stuff. And it came more and more to the fore until it was clear it was going to be a book about those two things. And actually, writing the book helped a great deal in terms of reconciling those two parts of myself, but also just understanding myself a lot better.
Okay, well, let's pick up on the other strand, the childhood stuff, as you say. I mean, there is written in the book about the sexual and physical abuse you experienced in your home from those who should have been protecting you, and it is a graphic and it is a visceral account of those experiences. And you said at the beginning you don't shrink away from that. I felt when I was reading it, I wondered if your influence, knowing so much about film, knowing so much about cinema and the way you tell a story graphically, if that had influenced you in your writing of this area or of this strand.
Yeah, I'm not sure it did, but I definitely, there's a different style, I think, arguably, to my remembrances of my childhood. And I wanted to hopefully be able to craft what memory genuinely feels like, and what how you experience it, really, because I think there's a difference between how you live events in real time and then how you remember them decades later. And memory is all insular, and it's something you experience by yourself, and it's about tastes often, and shapes and shadows and the feeling of something on your skin, and it is an experience like you experience an event now. And so I wanted to be able to craft what revisiting memory genuinely feels like. Somebody wrote, it feels a bit kind of like an acid trip in places, and I think that's what memory can feel like when you're having flashbacks, when you're having kind of fragments of memory disrupt your thoughts at times when you weren't expecting it. That can feel like a kind of an acid trip. And so I deliberately wrote it in that style, but only really to try and craft a accurate representation of how it felt to be revisiting that trauma and to have that trauma ever intrude on my thoughts. And then when it came to kind of the very detailed part of it, I did think, I don't want to cut away from what these experiences really look like and what these experiences really feel like to go through. And that for me necessitated a lot of detail. I didn't want to cut away, which probably would have made it a more comfortable read for some people. It would have made it more comfortable to write. But I just felt it would have been such a disingenuous representation of trauma and of those traumatic events.
And potentially to let down the person you were then?
Probably more to let down anybody reading it who recognised it and knows that's not how it goes, and knows that that's not how you experience or remember it, and knows that's not what trauma looks like, and it's not what the reality of self-harm looks like, and it's not the reality of what suicidal ideation looks like, and it's not an accurate representation of what it's like to be a small child and be abused. I didn't want to let probably those people down, because I think, there is something liberating in putting down the often excruciating, uncomfortable truth, because, part of the secrets, I think, and the shame that exists around abuse specifically is we often can't find the words to talk about it at all. That's part of how it stays hidden. That's part of how it stays a secret. And finding the words and being able to express it in language and being able to put that down on the page felt like a step for me in the right direction of being able to have more of a honest conversation around those things.
And in order to get to that aim, you were willing to go through that trauma again, to dig deep into the memories, to try and commit it to the page in the most realistic way possible.
Yeah, and that was, probably the most difficult part of writing the book. And it is, it was incredibly painful, and it was incredibly difficult. Those days that I spent on those chapters were some of the hardest days. But it just felt like the commitment I'd made, and it felt like the deal when you write a book like this. And I didn't want to flinch away from it because it was difficult for me, because, you know, hiding away from those memories and not revisiting that stuff probably caused me as much difficulty and pain as revisiting it did. So I don't think, you know, keeping it suppressed and keeping it hidden and turning away from it, that never proved to be the answer to me. And while I would never say writing the book was cathartic, because, you know, I don't want to be dishonest about that, it wasn't. There is still something at the end, seeing it committed to paper, seeing, you know, my truth written down, there is definitely something liberating and a great relief in that.
Thank you. It's such a huge leap from your experience and from that strand to editing time now in New York. It's almost impossible to kind of work out how you did it, because that experience is not in the book. But, you know, how did you build the confidence, the self that could do this, the kind of resilience that you needed to kind of get out, get an education and achieve so much?
Well, so I had a very supportive nana who, you know, from a very young age wanted me to be educated, wanted me to go to university. Nobody in our family had ever been in further education or gone to university, so it was a big deal for her. And I remember that being her wish for me since I was a little girl. And then it became clear to me, because I was good at school, I achieved a lot, and I think I worked out very quickly that this could be a place where I succeeded, where I was of value. I used to love when I did something right at school, or I wrote, you know, a good story, or I got full marks. I got such a buzz off of, you know, the teachers being really pleased with me, because it was such a difference to what home was like. And just like, you know, school became my focus and kind of my refuge, and then I transferred that onto my career. So I was very committed, I was very dedicated. I was very, very ambitious. I was determined to be a magazine editor before the age of 30. And again, I think, you know, it was both something to immerse myself in that I felt was positive, and I think it was a way for me to feel valued and like I was important and like I had something to contribute. And I probably also thought that if I developed a great career and had certain successes, then, you know, maybe I'd become the person that I'd always been trying to be. Maybe in that experience, I'd become the woman that I always hoped I'd be. But when you kind of try and find your sense of self in a job or in a salary or, you know, in any of these external places, it often doesn't work out. So what you'll find is, and what I certainly found is, there was no kind of job good enough. There was no situation where I could be successful enough that would fix everything. But I think New York was kind of the ultimate articulation of that. Was right, if I can go to New York, work on a big magazine there and be a success, then maybe that will be the thing that fixes everything. Because actually there's no bigger city than New York, there's no bigger job than a job editing a magazine on New York. And I think I was still chasing that same aim. But the reality is, you know, you're never going to find what you're looking for in a job if the rest of your life is lying there waiting for you untackled.
Yeah, and once New York, the kind of ultimate dream, couldn't deliver on that, there's nowhere else to go. But yeah. I've been reading a lot about grief recently, and, you know, really interested in this idea that you know, I think you mentioned it again earlier, you never get over grief. What you tend to do is incorporate that into your identity as part of you, and it becomes less overwhelming as it becomes integrated with your sense of identity. Is the experience of trauma similar to grief in that way?
Yeah, so kind of as I mentioned, I always thought it was about getting over it. So I was like, if I can get over it, then everything will be great. I just need to work out how to do that. And until I can work out how to get over it, I'm just going to bury it. But actually, there was a realization that I'll never get over this. This is not something you can ever get over. And I think all you can do is try and have it sit alongside you. And, you know, part of that is saying, yes, this did happen to me. And I think I was so keen for it not to define me that I kind of banished it from myself completely. But what you have to do is learn to live with it without letting it define you. And it doesn't have to define you in any way, shape or form, but whichever way you cut it, it's part of your life and part of who you are. I certainly wouldn't be the person that I am without it. And that doesn't mean, you know, it's in any way, oh, well, it made me a stronger person. That narrative doesn't sit easily with me at all. But the shape of who I am, the texture of who I am, the detail of who I am, all of that is created from everything I've been through in my life, including that. So I think it is about reconciling yourself with it and developing a better toolkit to be able to cope with it.
It's just so good to hear that trauma doesn't have to define you. You know, it's just such an unusual thing to hear, and it, you know, you make that point so clearly in your book. But it is a book, and books have definite ends, you know, and processing trauma and mental health is messy and long and ongoing. So I wanted to ask you about how you brought the two together. You know, how did you find an ending for something that, you know, the book demands an ending, but as you say, you know, it doesn't have a neat ending.
No, and it's not the book. The book obviously has an ending, so it has to end at some point.
Right.
But it's more like, I think, a snapshot. You know, it ends when, no spoilers really to say, it ends when I leave New York. And I always knew that's where I wanted to end the book, even though I wrote it a few years after I'd been back from New York and I was kind of more happily living in London, because I was very clear, and I had great support in this from my publishers at Canongate and my editor, that I didn't want it to be a traditional 3-act structure where there was any sense of resolution or redemption at the end, because, as you say, trauma doesn't work like that, life doesn't work like that, and I felt that would have been incredibly dishonest, but also isolating to people who maybe still are where I was, or, you know, have battled with those things themselves. Any of those people know it's bullshit, quite frankly, to be wrapping it up with a nice bow on the top at the end. So I kind of did away with that kind of structure and just decided to end it. And it's more like a pause, you know, there's an end, and it's like it's more like a semicolon than a full stop is what I'd say. It just kind of, it ends at a point that felt kind of satisfying, but it's certainly, I wouldn't describe it as a happy ending. I suppose there's a bit of hope at the end, but it was really important not to present it as as something where you only really achieve a happy ending through certain things. So, for example, when I was editing the book, I found out I was pregnant, and I now have a son. I have a partner, and, you know, perhaps with another publisher there may have been pressure to incorporate that into the end of the book, maybe put an extra chapter on the end to kind of let everyone know that, oh, I'm okay now because I've got these things that are signifiers of success in life. And there was never any conversation about that, because it was very clear that, you know, my life has moved on to a next chapter, but I don't have a happy ending because my life is still going. There is no ending yet. And I don't know, you know, what my mental health will look like in 2 years or in 10 years. This is just the latest chapter of hopefully a very long life. So yeah, the end was very, very important to me, and I'm really thrilled we managed to put that out in the book and to have that published as I'd originally kind of intended.
There's a couple of things I want to say there. One is that, now I've heard you say that, although, you know, as you say, you don't know what your mental health will be like in the next couple of years, but you have said that you have felt contentment since you have, you know, in the last couple of years in a way that you hadn't before.
Yes, and that was really important, because I think we all strive for happiness, right? Because that's what we're told is the ultimate state is to be happy. And you know, the thing is with my happiness, and I sought joy from promotions and from my job and from those things, is you get these peaks, but also I was experiencing these kind of massive lows. And it was, you know, it was before I met my partner, way before the baby. I was back in London. I was living on my own. I had a job that I really liked, but that wasn't all consuming. I had great relationships with my friends and with my family. Now, I just remember one morning thinking, oh, you know, I feel, and I was trying to find the word for it. I was like, I feel something. What do I feel? And then I was like, oh, I feel contentment. well, I didn't even know what this felt like. And it was amazing because it just felt steady and nice, and not these huge peaks and not these crashing lows. Just every day felt okay, you know. And that's not to say there weren't kind of ups and downs, but it was so level and so nice just to feel contented and balanced with everything. And since then, that's kind of what I've always strove for, is to feel contentment. And that's, I think, a much more realistic aim than to want to be happy constantly.
Yeah, I think it's really attainable. Well, not really attainable, but it's definitely something to aim for.
Yeah.
Unlike happiness, which can be a real pressure. We're going to go to a break in a minute. I just wanted to ask you one question to kind of before we go to questions, and that was you mentioned you had your son 4 months ago, and I just wondered if it had given you a different perspective on being on your parenting, becoming a parent.
Well, because people often said, oh, you know, if you ever become a parent, you'll maybe have more understanding for your own parents, because you'll realise they were just kind of human beings doing their best. But I actually found the complete opposite, to be honest. So I'd always thought I wouldn't have kids. I was very concerned, as I write in the book, I was very concerned that if I became pregnant, that I would become evil somehow, that maybe my DNA was hardwired to be a bad parent. I was really concerned about that, and I just didn't think that I could be a parent because of that. And when I was pregnant with my son, you know, from the moment I found out, I knew instantly that I would be a good mother, that I would not repeat the cycle, that I would do everything within my power to protect him, to make him know that he was loved, to make him feel safe, to make him feel all those things that I think any child should expect to be able to feel every single day. And it made it more difficult, quite honestly, to understand my own parents, to understand how that level of protection wasn't afforded to me. And it didn't, you know, I was worried it might bring up or kind of exacerbate my feelings about my own parents, but it kind of didn't. It made me a little bit sad that I'd had the experience I'd had. But, you know, I get to break the cycle with my own son. I get to do things completely differently. He will have his own story, and that story will look nothing like my story. I'm sure, you know, I'll mess up at times, and I'm sure, you know, like I'll drive him mad at certain points. But all of those things will be normal things that happen between a mother and her son. And he has been such a joy to me. And just the knowledge that things can be different has been just absolutely revelatory.
Oh, thank you, Terri. What a great place to have our break, so everyone can get something to drink or a cup of tea or some more crisps, whatever you want to have. And we'll be coming back in how long, Dickon? 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
5 minutes to put our questions to Terri. Thank you. Hello and welcome back to Coming Undone with Terri White. Terri, we've got a question here from Victoria, and she says she thinks the balance of childhood and New York works really well and actually helps solidify that idea of being two different people. Is so true. And she says that trauma's ugly and uncomfortable and really nailed it, and she applauds your bravery, as I'm sure so many people do. And she also mentioned she can't talk to her sister properly because she can't handle it. It's obviously a very difficult situation to talk about. And she just wanted to know, how did you decide that you wanted to write this?
Well, I think I knew I wanted to write about New York first. And as I said, like this, the childhood stuff was just kind of forcing its way out and onto the page. And every time I came to write something more about New York, I ended up writing about these little events from my childhood. It wasn't even in a structured way initially. I was just thinking about remembering this and writing a little, almost like a little story about that, and then writing another one over here. But it just, I knew it was a book I had to write. I felt compelled to write it in the end when I was in a much more stable place, when I felt able to look back on it with a bit of distance. I knew that it was a book that I just had to get out of me, really. And I think in that sense, writing it for myself was really important, because there was something about getting it out of me and laying it bare that did help with coming to terms with it. But as I was writing, it was almost like the childhood stuff, like it was writing itself. It was just all coming out onto the page. And that structure really was decided by that happening over and over again every time I sat down to write about New York. And in the end, it was just clear to me that even if nobody ever bought it, I didn't know at that point if anybody would ever want to publish it, ever. And that wasn't kind of the point, really. I wanted to write it. I wanted to get it out. And then, you know, the thought that anybody did want to publish it was kind of phenomenal to me, that somebody wanted to publish that story and that they thought it was important enough. I think when you come from a background like mine, when you come from a working class background, you often feel like your story isn't valued, like it has no real value to kind of larger society, that why would people want to read a book about me, about what I've been through? And I think part of what it became was wanting to give a voice to girls like me and to girls who'd been what I'd been through and maybe still are. And in the end, even though I started writing it for myself, I think I finished writing it for those girls.
Okay, thank you. It's a brilliant answer. We've got a question from Juan, I think, and they are saying, sending lots of love from Springwell.
Yeah, that's the local school to my village.
Oh, okay. Hello, hello, Springwell. And it's a great question. Could I ask what your advice would be? Can I ask what advice your 40-year-old self would give to your younger self, your teenage self?
I tell her probably to just not to listen to what everybody else told us. So I think I think a lot of young people from my background, both girls and boys, I think, you know, we're often told we're not good enough. We're often told, you know, I was told by one particular partner of my mum's that I was nothing, that I'd never be anything, that I wasn't worth anything, that life would always be shit. And I remember really internalizing that and believing it. And although it drove me in some respects, that voice in your head is really damaging and is definitely part of why my mental health became what it was. And I wish when I was younger I just had more of a sense of self and my own value to be able to not listen to that stuff, to know that came on his part, that came from a place of misogyny, that came from a place of his own insecurities. And I wish I had more confidence to be able to just walk my own path in life without being weighed down by those messages and what I heard every day. And that comes from just knowing yourself, knowing your own value. And big up Springwell, I have to say. That's so exciting that somebody from Springwell is on here.
Hooray, hooray, thank you. And hello, Springwell. Great question, thank you. Question from Michelle. And she said, have you been back to New York City since you left? How does it feel to visit the city now? Yes, how does it?
Yeah, I went back. Yeah, I went back for work. Because obviously I had Empire, so I spent a lot of time in Los Angeles, but I'd gone to New York for some meetings. And it was so weird. It was like, you know, when you run into your ex-boyfriend in the street and you're thinking, I really hope you don't look too hot and you're having like an off day and you're not that funny and you're not that smart when I talk to you. Because when you go back, especially when you have a fleeting experience with New York, when it's just a couple of days, and you know you're going across the bridge and it's all beautifully lit and you see the Empire State Building towering above, all of that kind of, as you called it, the seduction, all of that still exists. So the first time I went back was really weird because part of me, probably for a couple of years after I left, thought, did I do the wrong thing? Because people would often kind of flinch when I said I'd left New York. They go, oh, really? Why did you leave? Like somebody asked me if I'd actually been fired from my job and had no choice to come back, which wasn't true. But I think people find there's such a disconnect for people of somebody choosing to leave a city like New York. So when I went back, I remember thinking, oh God, I hope I don't feel like I did make a massive mistake. And I didn't, but it was hard to walk down those streets. But it's funny because I was noodling around with stuff that would end up in the book. And the moment I kind of stepped foot on the sidewalks in Manhattan, I remembered how isolated I felt and how lonely, and that kind of oppressive nature of New York that I felt when I walked around the city was back almost immediately. And so it actually reminded me very viscerally of why I left.
I can see that. Thank you, Michelle. I've got a question from Helen, and it's a big one. And that's what, if any, is your relationship with your extended family like now, and have they reacted to the book at all?
So I'm very close to my brother and sister, who have been incredibly supportive of the book. They've been incredibly supportive of me publishing it. My auntie on my mum's side, she's also been incredibly supportive. So having kind of those three people in my corner was really important, actually. And I didn't ask anyone's permission to write the book because I think you either know that you have to write this book or you don't. And I think as soon as you obviously ask permission, if that person turns around and says no, you have to be willing to walk away from the book because you've invited them to basically be able to nix it. And I felt very strongly that my story is my story to tell. And as long as I did it honestly and fairly, then there was no problem with me doing that. I did kind of keep a lot of family members out of the book because their stories aren't mine to tell. So the events in the book kind of all they went through a bit of a rigor in terms of everything in there had to directly relate to me, and every event had to have contributed to the trauma and to the thread of the book. I didn't just put in lots of different events from over the years that may have actually been compelling stories that actually may have been great for the page but didn't serve the narrative. And also I was very careful not to, tell stories about people that kind of revealed something about them that they wouldn't want to be revealed, because there's a responsibility you wield when you write, and you're the one who has the power on the page, and you have to be careful not to abuse that power. So my brother and sister aren't in the book very much, which was a deliberate choice. But yeah, they have been incredibly supportive and we're incredibly close. And though my relationship with my brother and sister is a big reason that I came home, and it's been incredibly helpful in terms of me getting well again.
Okay, thank you, Helen. I've got a question from Elizabeth, and she says, I like the way you accept things as another level of your life rather than something to overcome. Accepting seems to me to be taking, and therefore it's in your power to do something with it.
Yeah, and I think that's. I always thought the way of taking power over my trauma was to completely dismiss it and to completely eradicate it. from my life, and that was me taking back control of what had been done to me. But it became very clear that actually the way to take control and to take control of the narrative really was to accept it and to find a way to live with it on my terms. And I think that is really the ultimate way of taking back control from the people who have stolen it from you.
Thank you. And thank you, Elizabeth. We've got a question from Natalie M, and she says, Terri, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's clear to see that childhood trauma is wide and long, and you'll make decisions under the weight of it for many years beyond it. I wanted to ask you how you could be a good friend to someone who's experienced this.
It's difficult because what you'll often find is that person hides things from you. They are secretive. They only show you certain parts of themselves. So I think I hid a lot from my friends for a long, long time. So you may find that that person doesn't want to tell you or doesn't want to share with you. And that's not because they don't love you or they don't trust you. It's because that's part of their bigger picture in terms of trying to suppress it. The moment you start to admit it to other people, it becomes real. And I think, I've had very good friends over the years who obviously knew something was wrong and that there'd been some kind of trauma, but never knew the kind of detail of it. And all you can really do is be there for that person if they choose to talk about it, when and if they do. And I think you said earlier about it being messy, and that's the reality of it. It is messy. I wasn't always the best friend. I wasn't always the best sister. I didn't always behave as I'd like to have done. And in the book, I'm very honest about that, because I wanted to be really open about the ways in which I'd been messy and the things that I'd done to other people. So there's a story about ruining my friend Dave's book launch party in New York, which, I still feel terrible about. But, he forgave me and he was very gracious about it because he knew the difficult time I was going through. So if you can kind of maybe give them a little bit of latitude and try and understand why they may be behaving in a messy or chaotic or self-destructive way, but all you can really do is let them know, I think, that they're there, that you're there when they are ready to talk, if they become ready to talk, which they may not do.
Because I think, in the book, you, as you say, it's your story and you strip away everything that doesn't serve the narrative or isn't your story to tell. But you have written afterwards about friends being incredibly important to you.
Yes.
So they were there for you throughout. You have these incredible friendships that have been really fortifying through the whole experience of processing the trauma. No.
Yeah, even in New York, so I met my best friend Lindsay, I think 3 days after I moved to New York. We were introduced by a mutual friend. And even though, she didn't know the detail of what had happened, she could see me, getting drunk when I shouldn't have been, drinking too much when we went out, sneaking to the bar to have a shot of whiskey when I didn't think she was looking, turning my phone off for 3 days at a time, and she was incredibly loyal and incredibly steadfast in that entire time. And as I say, even though she didn't know the detail of what had happened, she clearly knew that I was struggling, and she was incredibly loyal and was just there, as I just described. She was just there if I ever needed to talk. I knew that she was, and I wasn't ready to for a long time. But if I hadn't have had her in New York, I think it would have been an even worse situation than it was. I had some counselling in my early 20s, and the counsellor said, you need pillars and people in your life who offer support, and if you don't have those pillars, you end up on your arse, basically. And certain friends and my family have definitely been and still remain those pillars for me, and their support has been incredibly important in terms of coming to terms with it, but also being able to talk about it and write about it now.
Let's hear it for the pillars.
Let's hear it for the pillars.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Natalie. Got a question from Adele, and she says, she said lockdown is going to be an even more difficult time for those whose homes are a place of abuse and are not safe. What advice do you have for someone who suspects they know of someone who's experiencing some kind of abuse, particularly within lockdown? Or, what advice do you have for someone who, I think what's absent from your book is the the social services, the person who could get involved, who could help you. You know.
Well, I always say report if you've got any suspicions whatsoever. You know, we had a neighbour who we spent 6 weeks in a women's refuge after my mum had a relationship with a man who was incredibly violent over a period of years. And we went to live in this refuge. We came home, and one of the neighbours said when we came back, "Oh, we could hear you screaming, but we didn't want to interfere." And it's a line that's always stuck with me. Like, the thought that you can hear a woman and her children screaming and do nothing is abhorrent to me. But I think the reality is that a lot of people still see things like domestic violence, for example, as something that happens behind closed doors. Most children who are sexually abused are overwhelmingly abused by somebody they know and in the family home. So the reality is, I think we all have a responsibility as members of a functioning society to do everything within our power to get help to those we think need it. And that does mean often, even if you're not sure, picking up the phone and calling, whether it's the police, whether it's the local council, whether it's social services, and basically expressing your concern. Because if there is nothing going on in the house, then that will be resolved, but also you could save somebody's life or save them going through something that they'll end up having to live with for the rest of their life just by picking up the phone.
Yeah, thank you, Adele. We've got a comment from Alan who says, not a question as such, but just to say Terri's a very inspiring woman and very much looking forward to reading her book. And if anyone else wants to get the book, we are an independent bookseller. We'd be very, very happy to send it to you. So please, you can buy it from us after the session if you'd like to. Thanks, Alan. You set me up very nicely there. We've got a question. You talked about your family earlier, I think, with a question from Helen, and a question from Anne, who says she's read the book. It's an incredible read, but she wanted to ask you about your relationship with your mother and if you held her responsible for not protecting you. In what way did you hold her responsible for not protecting you as a child?
Yeah, I think I definitely did. And it's something I've grappled with because, let me be clear, the responsibility lies pretty much solely with the men who did those things. I'm not a great fan of excusing male behaviour and blaming women for the behaviour of men. But that said, you know, she invited those men into our homes. We were put in that danger. And I think as a mother, and as a parent, actually, you have a responsibility to protect your children. And we definitely weren't protected. You know, she had kids incredibly young. And, you know, 16 when she had my brother, 18 when she had me. She was probably not anywhere near emotionally ready to have children and be responsible for children, but she had them. And in that case, I think you have a responsibility to protect them and to care for them on a basic level. So it's something I've found incredibly difficult because it's much more complicated and nuanced than my feelings about the men who abuse me, for example. I think I'll always find it incredibly difficult to understand why she made some of the choices she did. I'll always find it incredibly difficult to understand why we weren't protected. I don't think that will ever change. But as I said, I think all I can do really in a positive way is ensure that the cycle is broken with me, that I don't repeat the same mistakes, and that I do everything in my power to be a completely different kind of mother.
Thank you. And that thank you for telling us that, Terri, and it's a brilliant place to end, I think. One little question I just wanted to ask was, like, you know, normally when you publish a book, you're out on the road with it, and you're having to do everything, you know, digitally and do your events. Kind of, are you missing the room? Have we shown you enough love for your book? There's no audience to give you a massive round of applause, but we've loved it so much.
I know, and I did think this because I was excited about getting out and seeing people with my book and talking to people. But yeah, it's been lovely, and it's actually shown me the good side of social media and of the internet. I think it's easy to feel quite negative about both social and the internet at the moment. But everybody's been so lovely including everybody today. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk to everybody.
Oh, it's been really wonderful, and wish you all the luck for your book. Only in the first few days of it being published. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, Terri, and I do really recommend that everyone just get hold of Terri's book and reads it. Thank you, Terri.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being part of our Book Club Live. It's been such a pleasure to have you as part of our Coming Undone Book Club Live. And so I hope you have a pleasant rest of your Sunday evening and see you again. This Book Club Live is now closed.